Well, good morning. I wanted to call this meeting to order, and it's a forum. It's a forum by Democrats on the Resources Committee as the discussion, and first of all, let me thank all the witnesses. It was somewhat short notice, but centered to everything that's happening with the shutdown and the very bad consequences it's having across our nation. And not taking for granted at all the 800,000 plus potentially hundreds of thousands of other employees that work for contractors that are not furloughed and are not expecting any back pay, but everyone, and the effect on those families in particular, but the effect overall. And center to this whole discussion, why we're in the middle of this shutdown, center to it, and certainly the president has made that his point, that without it, the wall, that issues involved here, security, what the rationale behind this wall, of which is in the minds of many of us, and certainly the majority in the House of Representatives, non-existent. But we persist. We are now in the longest shutdown of this country. And it's all, I think, done out of almost an obsessive mythology is being created around the issue of the wall by Trump and others. And so we felt that as this discussion expand, and given the jurisdiction of this committee, which is our parks and our assets as a country, our public lands, and talk about that wall. I remember when and this is not a new phenomenon to any of our witnesses and many of you here, and certainly not to myself and to Mr. Sablan, who's been on this committee for a while. In 2005, the Secure Fence Act, and it was originally in the draft that my Republican colleagues were putting together, encompassed all borders, north, it encompassed the West Coast and the East Coast, and essentially, the secure fence affected the entire perimeter of the United States of America. Well, there was some obvious backlash to that, and dropped from it were the border with Canada, dropped from the Secure Fence Act was the coastlines, and left was the southern border with Mexico. And here we are. And as the discussion around the broken system of immigration that we all agree is broken, the mythology by this president and some of his allies in Congress, like Steve King, continue to persist. This wall was it, that its symbolism was too important, and that we were going to do it regardless. And now we're in this shutdown. And I wanted to call you, people that have worked on this issue on the southern border, work with communities on the southern border, represent communities, as the vice chairman does, on the southern border, and come in and talk directly to us, because this is part of the conversation. The impact this wall is having on communities, on our environment, on our public lands, on our culture, our history, and all that being done in the name of a myth. And so I hope we want to enlighten our colleagues here in Congress as well as the general public that there's a perspective on the wall, its impacts on the environment, its impact on communities that need to be heard as well by those most affected by the discussion that's going on in Washington and this shutdown. So I want to welcome you and thank you very much for being here. Welcome my colleague, Mr. Sablan, a valued member of this Resources Committee. And I would now just really turn it over to you as, for your comments. What is the time, 5? So each of you will have 5 minutes to make your statement, and then as members arrive, we'll turn it over for them for questions, comments, or to get additional reactions and information from you. Thank you very much. Also joined by my good friend and colleague, Mr. Lowenthal from California. With that, let me begin by asking a friend, a fellow dweller in the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona, and the vice chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation, Mr. Jose. Sir, 5 minutes are yours.
Good morning, Chairman Grijalva and distinguished committee members. My name is Raul Jose, and I am the vice chairman of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important forum today and to discuss impacts of a border wall on the Tohono O'odham Nation. Our people have lived in now Arizona in northern Mexico since time immemorial, long before the United States even existed. Today, our nation has more than 34,000 members located in southern Arizona, with approximately 2,000 living in Mexico in O'odham communities across the border. In history, we are one people. When the international line marking the boundary between the United States and Mexico was drawn, it sliced through the Aboriginal territory, separating our lands. As a result, our reservation in the United States shares a 62-mile border with Mexico, the longest international border of any Indian tribe in the United States. The Tohono O'odham Nation is deeply concerned about the negative impacts a construction of a wall would have on our people. First of all, a wall would further divide tribal lands and communities. We appreciate that the United States recognize our sovereign right to our reservation land on the United States side of the border. But to build a physical wall along the border would divide not just the land, but also would divide our people. For us, a physical wall creates heartbreaking with our members' rights to engage in traditional religious practices. Our nation's members regularly engage in border crossing for pilgrimages and ceremonies at important religious and cultural sites on both sides of the border. A wall that does not allow our members reasonable passage back and forth fundamentally interferes with our own right to our religion and our cultural practices. Further, the construction itself will disturb and destroy culturally significant sites, tribal archaeological resources, sacred sites, and human remains. A border wall would interfere with the flow and the use of the nation's scarce, vital water resources and negatively impact our natural resources. Our reservation is composed of desert lands. We rely on streams and waterways, including seasonal washers, filled during the monsoon season. Man-made watering holes used by cattle and wildlife. For example, the Bomri Wash is a large wash that crosses the border, and building a wall there would create a dam that would stop the natural flow of water and prevent water from reaching our reservation. This would be devastating to our resources, plants, animals, soils, and groundwater. A border wall would also have negative impacts on our wildlife, including some endangered species like the jaguar that are sacred to the American Indian. We are concerned about both negative impacts of the actual construction and about the negative impacts a wall would have on the migratory animals' ability to move freely in their habitat. Another thing that deeply concerns the nation is the waiver provision that was included in the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. The act allows the Secretary of the Department of Security to waive all legal requirements deemed necessary to affect border security. I want to say that again. Under the statute, the Secretary may waive all federal requirements. In 2008, such a waiver covering the nation reservation was in fact issued. We have lived on the front lines of the U.S.-Mexico border for a very, very long time. The nation's own law enforcement officers work closely with the Customs and Border Patrol officials, and we take border security and protection measures very seriously. But our longstanding experience tells us that building a physical wall on or near the reservation will not achieve the objective of securing the border in our area. To the contrary, for the reasons I have discussed today, building a wall on our reservation would instead do us harm. The nation greatly appreciates the committee's interest in hearing about our concerns wall on the reservation. We welcome continued dialogue with the federal government on these issues, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and we've also been joined by a colleague on this committee from California, Ms. Napolitano. Thank you very much for being here. I was remiss at the beginning. Yesterday, as part of this panel today, yesterday, Policy and Steering asked our staff to put together a presentation on the environmental impacts and the issue of the wall and the effects on public lands, national parks, etc. And we did that. And we also felt that it was important to also deal specifically with the issue of the wall and as the consequences of and the staff again invited you, and I'm thank you for agreeing and put this together, and I want to thank them and appreciate very much their initiative and doing it so rapidly. The same goes for the fine work they did with Policy and Steering. I received a lot of compliments, and I immediately took credit for the whole thing myself. One of those prerogatives of chairmanship, you know, it's wonderful. Anyway, and so I do want to thank them very much. With that, let me also invite for her presentation Ms. Jennifer Johnson, Border Policy Advisor, Southern Border Communities Coalition. Welcome, good to see you again.
Good morning. On behalf of the Southern Border Communities Coalition, a coalition of 6 I would like to thank Chairman Grijalva and distinguished members of the committee and staff for this opportunity to talk about the impacts of existing and proposed wall on border communities. The southern border region is one of the most diverse, safest, and economically vibrant regions in the country. Our southern border region, home to 15 million, is a place of encounter, hope, and opportunity, not fear and conflict. We are deeply disturbed by this administration's mischaracterizations of the region to justify a deadly, harmful, and wasteful border wall. Border communities have already endured the construction of 700 miles of walls and barriers built in towns, neighborhoods, and even our backyards. Regardless of whether the structures are called border walls, fences, levee walls, or barriers, and made of concrete, steel, or some other material, the harms are the same. Walls and the associated hypermilitarization make the trek to our border. Instead, they harm our homes, quality of life, endanger wildlife and the environment, and reflect a colossal waste of taxpayer dollars. Indeed, 30 cities and counties in the southern border region have issued resolutions opposing the border walls, including 16 cities in all 3 border counties in the Rio Grande Valley. In Texas, the vast majority of land adjacent to the border is privately owned. Hundreds of private property owners have been forced to give up their homes, businesses, farms, and ranches, some that have been in their families for generations through eminent domain seizures by the federal government for wall construction. In some cases, the Department of Homeland Security has used, quote, quick take condemnations to take possession of property and start wall construction even before just compensation has been determined and the property owner paid. And now, hundreds more are now at risk at losing a for South Texas. Border walls have inflicted serious damage upon border communities. For just one example, in 2008, flash floods in the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument and sister cities of Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora led to millions of dollars of damage and 2 deaths when floodwaters were blocked by a border wall. New wall plans planned for the Rio Grande floodplain in South Texas pose an alarming risk to wildlife habitat, property, and the safety of hundreds who reside in South Texas and neighbors across the river. Furthermore, the proposed wall would decimate the region's wildlife refuges and parks that are the cornerstone of an ecotourism industry that generates over $450 million annually for the Rio Grande economy. The destruction caused by border walls stem in part from the Real ID Act of 2005 that has allowed the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security quality of life to expedite wall construction. There is every indication that more waivers will be issued for further wall construction, undoubtedly leading to equally harmful walls and an absence of public input and review. Border walls also have contributed to the humanitarian crisis of migrant deaths on our southwest borders as they push border crossers into even more remote and rugged stretches of the border where their survival is at even greater risk. In 1994, the Border Patrol issued a strategic plan to expand border wall and militarization intended to force border crossers into, quote, hostile terrain. In the subsequent years, the remains of thousands of women, men, and children have been found along migrant border crossing routes, and thousands more are believed to lie unrecovered. And although the number of apprehensions by the Border Patrol has decreased in recent years, the likelihood of a border crosser perishing in southern border communities are only meant to justify further wall construction. However, the only crisis we see in border communities is one stemming from excessive, unchecked militarization and a humanitarian crisis of this administration's own making, a crisis of people fleeing violence and seeking refuge in a country that has historically been a beacon for refugees throughout the world. We ask Congress and this committee to be bold and advance policies that revitalize, not wall in and militarize our communities. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And let me ask Mr. Robert Garcia, founder and counsel of the City Project, someone whose sincere and learned opinion is always wise counsel. So
thank you very much, Chairman Grijalva, and the staff of this committee, Chris Espinosa, and the other honorable members of this committee. It's an honor to be here. I do dedicate these comments today to Jacqueline Kyle Makin and Felipe Gomez Alonso, the innocent Guatemalan children who have died at the border in the hands of Donald Trump and this administration. Soy guatemalteco. Todos somos inmigrantes. Todos somos americanos. I am a human rights attorney. People live and dream on the border and beyond, and it's necessary to restore government, put people back to work, protect the environment, save justice, democracy, and the rule of the fear, the hate, the lies, and the greed that drive his effort to close the government because of his fear of not being reelected, his fear of the ongoing investigation, including by my former office, the Southern District of New York, where I served in the Public Corruption Unit, and his fear of conviction. I am an immigrant. I came to the United States when I was 4 years old with my family. My father, Roberto, was deported twice before that. My uncle Julio came to the United States without papers in order to join the Air Force. Being afraid of being deported, his commanding officer helped Julio obtain his citizenship papers. And my uncle Julio and here I am. I arrived in the U.S. in New Orleans as a port of entry with my cousin Leo and other members of my family. Leo was 2. He has a Harvard MBA. He is now the head of a nonprofit educational organization that provides counseling to other young students wishing to make their dreams come true. I arrived at 4. I graduated from Stanford and Stanford Law School, where I served on the board of editors of the Stanford Law Review. I am a human rights and civil rights attorney. Our brothers and sisters and cousins and children have graduated from Cornell, Boston University, Princeton, other elite colleges. They are social and business entrepreneurs. And good citizens and residents. They do not fill only jobs that nobody else wants. We pay taxes and we vote. And my family is here because of the type of family migration that Republican supremacists condemn now as chain migration, and that Trump's own family used to be here. Why are we here? We are here for the same reasons many immigrants come today, because of blowback against U.S. oppression in Latin America and other nations. The U.S. overthrew the democratically elected government in Guatemala in 1954, and since then has been responsible for propping up military dictatorships and oppressive governments that have resulted in the killing of 2 more, according to the Catholic Church and the United Nations. And again, that's why I am here. Pope Francis is Latino. His family migrated to Argentina. He prays for immigrants. These brothers and sisters of ours were trying to escape difficult situations to find some serenity and peace. They were looking for a better place for themselves and their families. In the U.S., over 6,000 people have died in the past 20 years at the border. Pope Francis asks, has any one of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters? We weep and we fight for immigrants, for human rights, and the rights of Mother Earth. Thank you. I have written comments that I will submit that refute each of Trump's lies. There is no immigration crisis at the border that the wall will solve. Most immigrants who are here without documents arrived with papers and overstayed their visas. The wall will not stop child smuggling. Most children come with their families across the border, not as unaccompanied minors. The wall will not stop illegal drug trafficking. I also served in the narcotics unit, prosecuting international drugs. Most illegal drug trafficking comes through other ports of entry, not across the border. The wall will not stop violent crime. The crime statistics among the immigrant population are lower than among the general population. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, Mr. Trump, stop this wall. Put the nation back to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me now ask Christine Hazard, Associate Director of Government Affairs for the National Parks Conservation Association. Thank you, Ms. Hazard, for being here. We're looking forward to your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Grijalva, members of the committee, thank you for providing this opportunity to discuss the impact of border barriers on national parks and public lands. I'm Christina Hazard. I'm the Associate Director for Government Affairs at the National Parks Conservation Association. Founded in 1919, NPCA is the leading voice for protecting and enhancing America's national park system for present and future generations. There are 6 national parks on the U.S.-Mexico border, 2 in Arizona and 4 in Texas. Of those sites, half have man-made border barriers, and the remainder have significant natural barriers. These national parks are connected to the lands and communities that surround them, and the impacts of border activities must be considered comprehensively. For example, Big Bend National Park in West Texas is one of the more isolated parks in the lower 48. The park's 118-mile southern boundary is the Rio Grande River and includes Santa Elena Canyon. With a Class 4 rapid and up to 1,500-foot cliffs, it is nothing short of spectacular. Not be quite as high, there is no question that this natural barrier makes crossing the border in this region treacherous, if not impossible. Big Bend does have an official port of entry. Visitors traveling to Boquillas are greeted by a National Park Service law enforcement officer and speak to Border Patrol agents in El Paso via video conference. Hours from the nearest town in Mexico, Boquillas relies almost entirely on tourism. When the port of entry was closed from 2002 to 2013, the economic impact on the town was significant. The border may create two separate countries, but the reality is an extensive connected ecosystem and many connected communities. Along a different section of the border, Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona is home to 31 species of cactus, Sonoran pronghorn, and centuries of human history. It is also Pipe's 30-mile border, and 5 miles of 15-foot pedestrian wall flank the Lukeville port of entry. According to Customs and Border Protection, the pedestrian wall at Oregon Pipe was designed to accommodate a 100-year flood. In July 2008, the wall was tested, as a summer storm delivered over an inch of rain to the park in under 2 hours. Water drained directly into the border barriers. Silt and debris were caught by the wire mesh wall, resulting in high water marks up to 7 feet, flooding of local businesses, and a disturbed habitat once the floodwaters receded. All impacts that the wall was supposedly designed to prevent. The waiver authority provided to the Department of Homeland Security through the Real ID Act of 2005 prevents the National Park Service, other federal land managers, and the public from participating in decision-making processes for construction along the border. At Oregon Pipe, they could have provided accurate information on flooding in the region and may have helped determine that a wall was not the best solution for achieving both environmental and security goals. According to a 2017 GAO report, Customs and Border Protection does not have metrics to determine border fencing's impact on diverting illegal entries or apprehension rates over time. So while CBP cannot prove that building a wall is achieving their stated goals, our public lands and local communities are feeling the impacts. Already appropriated funds are being used to build new border walls through the Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. Replacement walls have already been built in New Mexico and California. And although the plan to replace pedestrian wall at Oregon Pipe is known to the public, there has been no opportunity for public involvement. Again, because it will negatively impact these ecosystems in the short and long term. We're also concerned that the push for more border wall construction will target federal lands. Conversion of existing vehicle barriers at Oregon Pipe or neighboring Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge would further disturb habitat for the endangered Sonoran pronghorn. And while there seems to be general agreement that building a 30-foot wall atop the cliffs of Big Bend is not the best use of resources, walls built elsewhere in the region could impact river ecology and wildlife migration corridors. The two examples offered today from Big Bend and Oregon Pipe are emblematic of impacts at all the parks along the border, along with the numerous wildlife refuges, state parks, and tribal and private lands that collectively conserve diverse ecosystems, protect wildlife corridors, and serve as gathering places for communities. There's no question that border security is vital to our country, which is why it's so important we get it right. We need to look for solutions that are as unique as our landscapes and our communities, and ensure the solutions we find don't destroy the national treasures we've committed to protecting. A border wall is not the answer for our national parks or our border communities. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce Mr. Raul Garcia, Senior Legislative Counsel, Earth Justice. The time is yours, Tocayo.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, distinguished members of the committee and staff. My name is Raul Garcia, Senior Legislative Counsel at Earth Justice, an organization that has been fighting against the border wall and the waiver of laws used to build it since 2005. We have a reputation to be the legal arm of the environmental movement. But in opposing the border wall, we recognize that the environment, civil and human rights are intrinsically connected. So our understanding is an intersectional one that evaluates the impacts of the wall across multiple sectors. We take into account the demonization of culture, the erosion of civil rights, and the degradation of the environment altogether. I have to begin with the palpable and unescapable truth that the border wall is immoral, motivated by hate, and deeply rooted in racism. At a personal level, this wall is an insult. I am an immigrant like many others. I was born in Mexico and brought to this country as a child. Since I came to this country, I've dedicated my career and my life to making this country a better place. And at the same time, I admire, love, and work towards the principles on which this country was founded. Unfortunately, however, dire and profound consequences. I must also clarify that even though the President begs to differ, the border is not in a state of crisis. In fact, the general border region is overall safer than other regions in the country. Communities with more immigrants, on average, have fewer crimes than those with less immigrants. And overall, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than the general U.S.-born population, according to the American Immigration Council. There is simply no valid and truthful justification for this wall. The wall is merely a gimmick used by the Trump administration to demonize communities and intimidate them from exercising their civil and human rights, among them the right to a healthy environment. Outside of the law. So let me repeat that. This wall is built outside of the law. In 2005, Congress passed the Real ID Act, which gave the Secretary of Homeland Security the power to waive any law he or she wants in order to build border barriers and roads. So far, this administration has used it to waive 37 laws that would not be waived anywhere else in the country. So these are laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water and Clean Air Act, laws that are pivotal to the health and safety of communities all around the country, particularly in the border. As just one example, I'd like to go over some of the impacts of waiving NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA is very simple. It's common sense. It does three what it's about to build. The second one is environmental review. The federal government has to study the impacts of what it's about to do and see if there are better ways to do it. The last one, and what I would argue is the most important, is public input. Making sure that other agencies, as well as the public, have a say and a voice into what is going to happen in their own backyards. Unfortunately, the Trump administration does not see this as a value. In the context of the border wall, they have waived NEPA several times. Just as one example, when barriers were built in Nogales, Arizona, as has been referenced, the administration waived NEPA. Since the required NEPA studies were not conducted, it was overseen that the debris, the natural debris and the garbage would actually pile up around the border wall that they already have there and act as an unintended dam. That dam essentially would alter the natural flow of water, and when torrential rains hit the region, it led to catastrophic flooding up to 6 feet in depth that caused millions of dollars worth in property damage and cost the deaths of 2 people. The waiver of laws, as has been stated, has also caused the desecration of important lands for indigenous communities. It has prohibited the public from legally challenging any federal government action when it comes to building the wall, even when that action would be illegal under our laws. and it further endangers animal species that are already threatened. The long list of laws that are consistently waived makes it clear that there is an intentionality to act outside of the rule of law. There is no reason to waive a law that you plan to abide by. That's very important as we move forward, because we have to make the impact, and we have to double down on the notion that this wall is justified by fiction, relying on the notion that southern border communities must be militarized and somehow deserve fewer protections under the law. To conclude, I have to say that the political calculations and discussions of the wall should be grounded in the real impacts that it causes. I continue to hear people speaking about compromising on the wall. They throw around numbers like 1.3, 1.6, and $5 billion. They throw around these numbers, seldom following up with what the impacts of what every single dollar in those billions is gonna cost for communities on the ground and for communities across the country that are being demonized. We urge Congress to stop enabling any further harm on communities on or to continue exercising the waiver of laws with which it is built. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mariana Wright is the Executive Director of the National Butterfly Center. Thank you for being here. Your perspective is welcomed.
Dear Chairman Grijalva and members of the committee, my name is Mariana Trevino Wright. I am Executive Director of the National Butterfly Center in Mission, Texas, which is privately owned and operated for our members and guests by the nonprofit North American Butterfly Association. This 100-acre property is ground zero for the first new section of border wall funded in a decade. Since 33 new miles of border wall were funded in March of 2018, we have struggled to resources to the public, as members of the media and Congress have argued there is no new border wall, only levee system improvements. This assertion is false. Last month, we met with 8 representatives of the Department of Homeland Security who are working with the Office of Border Wall Management to build the wall across our property and adjacent lands. They stated we should expect construction to begin next month. This means the bulldozers will roll into the lower Rio Grande Valley Wildlife Conservation Corridor, eliminating thousands of trees during spring nesting season for hundreds of species of migratory raptors and songbirds. Hence, the necessity for the waiver of the duly passed laws have been waived for this construction project in Hidalgo County that will destroy much of the little habitat that remains. According to Texas Parks and Wildlife, approximately 5% of our original vegetation remains in a region where endangered and threatened species like the ocelot, Texas tortoise, Texas horned lizard, Texas indigo, and peregrine falcon struggle for survival. The Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Clean Air Act are just a few of the laws waived that will negatively impact the wild creatures and features of South Texas, as well as our natural and cultural inheritance. Building the wall here along the Rio Grande River involves clearing all vegetation in the construction and enforcement zones, replacing our earthen levee with vertical concrete walls up to 18 feet tall, placing 18-foot-tall steel bollards on top, and creating a rubberized all-weather road on the south side of the wall. We already know the wall will exacerbate flooding and drown all terrestrial life trapped between the river and the wall. It will also increase erosion, make us vulnerable to actual land loss, and violate multiple international treaties with Mexico. Lastly, the proposed lighting, brilliant, all-night lights atop 22-foot-high poles placed every 150 feet will disrupt the crepuscular and nocturnal activities of all plants and animals, transforming what is now a vibrant but endangered ecosystem into a biological desert. All in all, more than 11,000 acres of public green space and private property will wind up behind the border wall, which split by this barrier, stripped of vegetation and lit up at night, will provide a sliver of fragmented habitat for rare and remarkable insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals found nowhere else in the country. Wherever the land is cleared, vegetation that provides sensitive breeding and feeding areas for wildlife will disappear. For example, each butterfly species is intimately tied to a couple of plant species their caterpillars can consume to complete their metamorphosis. So if you eliminate the plant from the landscape, you eliminate the butterfly. More than 250 of these cannot be found anywhere else. For more than 6 years, I have worked on this property. We are open 7 days a week to receive school children, outdoor enthusiasts, research scientists, community members, and curiosity seekers from every walk of life. We even host an annual sleepover under the stars for the Girl Scouts of the USA at a place many mistakenly believe to be dangerous and overrun by bad hombres. My husband and I have 6 children we have reared on the border. It's been a privilege and a joy to take them fishing and kayaking on the Rio Grande, to take family and friends on night hikes, and to lead folks through the woods to see their first Mexican blue wing or gray hawk. All of this would be long ago, Aristotle said, "Horror vacui," or nature abhors a vacuum. Please do not allow this horror to proceed, to destroy thousands of acres of public and private lands, condemn thousands of wildlife species, poison our air and our water, close our nature centers, and create a barren, no man's land behind an artificial barrier. Please, preserve our quality of life and our natural treasures by enacting a moratorium on the wall that has been funded in Hidalgo and Starr counties and proclaiming no more border walls. America is better than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to our colleagues that are here. Mr. Sablan left one question, if I may. This question is for Raul Garcia. Sablan's question is, you mentioned that the majority of the border wall has been built with waivers and therefore outside of critical legal requirements that have to be enforced for any other infrastructure project. How does this impact public input? Does it function to exclude the public from having a voice in that matter? And if so, how?
Thank you, Chairman. The wall essentially eliminates public input. The waiver of laws eliminates public input as a whole. A lot of the laws that I mentioned, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, do provide for public input to take place. And for communities, really with local expertise and local interests to be able to say, this works, this doesn't work, this is the right way, this is the wrong way to go about things. So it eliminates it from the process itself. However, it also eliminates the aftermath. It eliminates the public from participating in redressing any of these harms by going to a court of law. So part of the waiver is one of the laws waived is the Administrative Procedures Act. That is the law that gives the public a right of action in order to challenge harms done by the federal government that are illegally done. So by waiving the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, essentially the courthouse doors have been closed by the public, so that, say, a butterfly center or a farmer or a rancher on the border would be illegally harmed by any other law, even that is not waived, because the Administrative Procedures Act is the law that gives them the right of action. They have no recourse in court.
Thank you very much. Mr. Napolitano, any questions or comments? Floor.
No, not just a lot of comments. Listening to everybody, this administration seems to forget that South America is part of the Americas. We're all Americans. That waiving NEPA, which is one of the things that we hold dear in the rest of the United States, especially for the public input, is so critical, because it allows people to vent, whether it's taking of their property or whether it's damaging wildlife. It's important to recognize, but somehow they don't care. I think we need to go back to review the Real ID and maybe take a look at how we can tweak it so it doesn't give them the total right for a waiver. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, very much. Mr. Lota?
Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this forum on the disastrous impacts of President Trump's wall. And I want to thank all the members of the panel for educating us on the various impacts. I think it's so sad, I'm going to preface my remarks, I think it's so sad that instead of truly talking about how we protect our nation, our communities along the border, the ecology, the ecosystems, the environment, we spend time talking about how we destroy them and what we're going to do about this. This is a sad day for America. You know, I personally have grave concerns about the border wall, but I also have grave concerns about the separation of families, the elimination of DACA, the rolling back of immigrant rights. While this is still a meeting related to the issues of Natural Resources Committee, I'm going to focus my concerns about that, but I just want to say my concerns go far greater than what we're talking about here today. We're talking about the future and of democracy and what this nation stands for, whether we really truly respect the Statue of Liberty and inviting people to come here, or we're talking about walling off our nation from a democratic neighbor of ours. So this is really a very, very sad day that we're at. You know, we don't have to guess what the impact of wall construction will have on the ecosystems or our environment. You know, we already know there's 700 miles ramifications and impacts of these 700 miles. Well, I'm struck with, and it's been mentioned, that the Department of Homeland Security has already waived nearly 50 federal laws, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. All of this has been pointed out by the members of the panel. The Antiquities Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Native American Graves Protection Act, and the Repatriation Act, and so many, many more. You know, I represent California, Southern California, part of Southern California, where we see much of the impact of drugs. I know that the vast amount of drugs will not be stopped because of building a wall, will have no impact at all upon that. I see the Coast Guard daily dealing with what comes up from various places to California. I see the fact of 18-wheelers that come through the border without being inspected. We're not talking about a new wall. We're talking about why aren't we truly trying to focus on the problems that we have rather than separating us from the rest of the world. And I'm also very concerned with what Mr. Jose, the Vice Chair of the Tohono O'odham nation, I hope I pronounced that correctly, that you mentioned. You know, without tribal consent, when we go across native lands of Native Americans, at best, it reflects a lack of respect. But more importantly, it really reflects a complete disregard for the rights of Native Americans. This is outrageous, the fact that we are even talking about taking rights away from people. We know, let's focus on why we're here. We know that the wall severely impacts migratory as well as endangered and threatened animal species. Jaguars, wolves cannot scale these walls, nor dig tunnels, so we're going to impact that. We have seen existing barriers catch debris. They function as dams, not as walls to keep people out, and after rainstorm, they wreak devastation upon the communities. And we've seen a number of examples where this has already cost millions of dollars. But as this committee knows, and what this committee is focused on, with climate change upon us as a major threat to this nation, we are going to see more severe weather. We're only going to see situations like this get worse, and if a wall will be built, it's only going to exacerbate a crisis that we're already not dealing with. We're just going to make that crisis worse. So I have a few questions. Mr. Jose, can you speak to us about the work that the tribe currently does to prevent illegal entries into the United States? I believe you have already spoken to us about, or written about, that there's a close partnership between U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the tribe's law enforcement officers. Do you think continuing to foster that relationship would be a more effective way to prevent illegal crossings, or do you think building a wall is going to be the way in which we really can work on those issues that really provide us with security?
Chairman, esteemed committee members, and thank you for that question. Yes, you know, there was a young girl that was asked a question about what she would do to take care of all the border issues, and she thought for a minute, and she said, I think we need to go to the border and just all hold hands. And a lot of people laughed at her, and I sat there and I thought about it. She's very right. We need to go to the border and all hold hands. We need to work together. The Tohono O'odham Nation, we have 2.8 million acres of land there. Our law enforcement that patrols 2.8 million acres, we spent about 60–70% of our law enforcement time on border issues. On our tribal budget, we spend about $3 million annually on border issues. We continue to work together. We are Homeland Security. We'll always be Homeland Security. We're caught in the middle of that, and so we'll continue to work with partners to secure the border in whatever way that is. In 2006, the nation and the local communities compromised with installing vehicle barriers, but they had to be environmentally friendly. And we continue to use those vehicle barriers, and they continue to be there. And so, yes, we'll continue to work with the federal government and anyone to secure those borders, because everything that's coming through those borders are not intended for our communities. They're intended for cities and towns throughout America.
I want to follow up on that. It's my understanding that the San Miguel Gate is the passage that tribal members use to move back and forth between the U.S. and the Mexican sides of their land. What's that like? What's that process been for people to go back and forth? And if the President Trump is successful, which we are hoping that he's not, but if he is some reason successful in building this wall, how is that going to change what is going to happen?
Okay, when they did the vehicle barriers, thank you for the question, there were 3 traditional crossings that we insisted that they have, that we use daily, not only for domestic, religious, and ceremonial purposes. So we go through there, only Tohono O'odham Nation members are allowed to go through there. No other citizen is allowed to go through there. They have to go through the official port of entry. If a wall is built, we will no longer have no passage through there. Also, our traditional ceremonies that happen, that we use those traditional routes, are very important to us. Not only to us, but actually for the people in common and the world. In order for us to continue those ceremonies to keep the world in balance, we would have to distract from the original paths that we've been using for hundreds of years to do these things because of a wall that would be built.
I want to ask any of the panelists, I mentioned earlier in my statement about how we're going to increase the flood risk of building barriers and walls across 2,000 miles of border. And we know, as they pointed out, that they catch debris, they catch function as acting as dams after rainstorm. Do you see this as a major problem? I see that what we're going to do is do terrible damage, but I'd like to hear from any of you about what is it going to be like to build a barrier or a wall over 2,000 miles when we're seeing from climate change tremendous differences in weather patterns and much more rain in some parts of the country, my part of the country, much more drought. Can you tell us what you see as some of the impacts, any of you or all of you?
Thank you, Representative Lowenthal. At the National Butterfly Center in 2010, we experienced Hurricane Alex. At that time, our earthen levees had just been rebuilt and certified FEMA compliant by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, built to about 17 feet tall. The floodwaters crested at the top of the levee. We had 70 acres underwater on the banks of the Rio Grande River, 17 feet deep. It took 4 months for those floodwaters to recede. Then we had to clean up the debris. It took us 2 years to remove industrial waste, natural debris, carapaces from Texas tortoises that drown, carcasses from other animals like javelina and coyotes and raccoons. It was putrid. It was terrible. And we are at a bend in the river. Before the first border walls were built, the Department of Homeland Security commissioned an environmental study by Baker Engineering, a worldwide firm. There is a 900-page report from Baker Engineering that details how catastrophic the flooding will be, where and when and how and even to what degree. We are at a location where that blockage, where the wall will become a dam, as you say, that pushes water into Mexico, 100%. It is guaranteed. So I hope I've answered some of that question.
Well, you have answered a lot. If anybody else wants it. Yes, Mr. Jose.
Thank you for the question. Building a wall would dam certain areas. The government built a dam called the Painted Rock Dam in the Gila Bend area, and the result of that was Public Law 99503. If you build a wall on the U.S.-Mexican border, that would dam up some of the dry riverbeds that are there, and that would flood communities. Within that Vomri Wash by the San Miguel Gate, there is a community about half a mile to a mile away from there. There is a church there, there is a cemetery there, and the flood waters would back up and they would destroy those homes, it would destroy the church, and would destroy cemeteries. And that's what happened in Gila Bend in the San Lucie district way back when they built the Painted Rock Dam. It flooded back and it flooded all the community and the graveyard there. That's exactly what would happen on the U.S.-Mexico border in our traditional communities, just a stone's throw from the border.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I like referring to you as Mr. Chairman, for holding this forum to really talk about some of the challenges that we face with regards to a border wall and how we improve our security. I have a statement that I'd like to submit if we're keeping some sort of a record and unanimous consent, and I'd like to ask some questions because at some point we will figure out how we reopen government and end this travesty because I truly believe that it is irresponsible to shut down government. Unfortunately, over half the members of Congress have been here less than 6 years, and since this 2010, with the exception of the phenomena between Clinton and Gingrich back in the 90s, we never have allowed any individuals or groups to take a political agenda and use that as a means to shut down government, because frankly, one of the most important responsibilities as Congress is to have a budget. We have to have a budget. And guess what? There's a lot of things in the budget that we like, some things we don't like, but our nation needs to have a budget just like American families have a budget. I suspect many people would prefer not to make a car payment or a home payment, but guess what? It's a part of a monthly budget. So I want to try to deal with the challenges that we're talking about in terms of security and get past some of the rhetoric. We have, however you want to describe it, a security that has attempted to be improved because we have real issues of drug trafficking, sex trafficking, transnational gangs, and there are serious issues. And I was part of an effort back in 2006 and 2007 to dramatically increase border security. And there are more things that we can do. But I don't think this notion of a wall that really has to do more with a campaign promise over the last 2 years than actual border security improvement. And by the way, I thought Mexico was going to pay for this wall. I guess not. We're looking for American taxpayers now to pay for it. Is the practicality in terms of how we move forward with border security, because ultimately I think that's going to be a part of a budget agreement to reopen. I'm not certain who might be in the best position to respond to these. The reality is that there are a lot of things that we can do to improve border security. I mean, we provided $1.6 billion last year, and about 10% of that funding has been used to improve border security. We do, I think, I believe, need to hire more border control agents, more high-tech issues on some of the geographical barriers that are challenging among the 2,000-plus mile border between Mexico and the United States. But we do have almost 700 miles of a wall, a fence, a barrier, whatever you want to call it, especially in urban areas, down on the San Ysidro border in California and in places in Texas and in New Mexico and Arizona. So the President has spoken about the use of eminent domain to take private land to build a wall. That's not a new idea. We do this in other public works projects. But those attempts in the past in Texas, I know, have been fraught with litigation. And I'm wondering what we've learned from those efforts to use eminent domain to provide border security, and how that might fit with his desire to build this wall that I think ultimately is silly. But who would like to respond to that? I mean, we have a lot of folks there, farmers and ranchers and other people that have private property that want to protect their private property rights. Am I correct?
Representative Costa, thank you. Yes, the National Butterfly Center, the North American Butterfly Association, has filed suit against the federal government. We did that in December of 2017 because we discovered government contractors on our property in July of 2017, 9 months before Congress had voted or approved any funding for new border wall.
And this deals with sensitive habitat.
Absolutely.
And environmental impacts that are the basis of your lawsuit.
Well, the lawsuit also deals with the de facto seizure of our property without any
Compensation.
Without compensation.
Or mitigation.
Or litigation.
Or mitigation.
Mitigation, excuse me. The Border Patrol, you talked about security. On our property, we are occupied 24 hours a day by Border Patrol. We have agents on foot, on horseback, on four-wheel ATV, on dirt bikes, in SUVs, in helicopters, in gunboats on the river, aerostat balloons, and a full tactical raid tower less than 1 mile from us. We have motion sensors planted on the property. We have video surveillance.
You're suggesting that the border's pretty secure where your habitat-sensitive area is for the butterflies, and they seem to coexist?
Yes, we do. We do not object to more technology or more agents. We already have 3,000 patrol agents in the Rio Grande Valley sector. In addition to this plethora of technology and equipment, we are actually located next door to the Border Patrol stables.
I'm not familiar with the area you're talking about, but I am told by some of my colleagues who represent the border that in some of the more remote places along the border, though, the timeline when a call is made is in hours and sometimes can take as long as a half a day.
I cannot.
But what you're saying is that you've been able to make it work under the current circumstances?
We have been able to make it work. Now, of course, we're dealing with eminent domain, as you've stated. One of the issues related to this that you may not be aware of is the government is proposing to seize the strip of land in which they will build the wall and put their enforcement zone and their all-terrain road. They are not proposing to seize or buy the land south of that between the river and the wall. As such, they cannot legally deny.
So you're creating a scenario under which it makes it almost impossible to get there from there. I mean, this notion that somehow we're going to...
Well, no, it gets better than that. Since they cannot deny us access to our land, they will be building gates, enormous gates, because we will have in the Rio Grande Valley country clubs with golf courses, residential communities, a Catholic church, a state park, the National Butterfly Center, and other places, all between the river and the wall. So they will be building gates large enough for tractors, for farms, for fire trucks that must render services to municipal communities, and others to pass through. And we all get the gate code. So every one of our members and visitors gets the code to the border wall gate.
I suspect it wouldn't be difficult for the transnational gangs and others to somehow get access to the codes.
Actually, now they won't have to bribe or blackmail any Border Patrol agent. They just have to join the National Butterfly Center. or have a, I mean, it embarrasses me.
I've got to Google up your center here. It sounds like a fascinating group of folks.
The ridiculousness of the plan to secure our border when literally thousands and thousands of people will have the code to the gate to the border wall. Yeah. How does that provide any sort of security?
God forbid should our president learn the gate code, because he'll blab it to everybody.
It'll be on Twitter.
Yes. Mindful of your time, and more importantly, the chairman's good nature of my time, I'd like to get some of the other witnesses to be able to respond. I'm really thinking about the issues, though. I mean, certainly along the river, I don't know how you build a wall, and I don't think a wall is necessary. I think in certain urban areas, we could reinforce those things that we could do to improve the barriers. But as we all know, the overwhelming majority of illegal drug smuggling that's taking place, as well as trafficking, is through legal ports of entry, and as well along the ocean. And now we've shut down the Coast Guard, which makes no sense, that is protecting our waters, in which a lot of those illicit drugs and other illegal activities are taking place. But I want to get back to the point on areas where you could put a barrier of some kind. The difficulty dealing with municipalities, whether they be counties or cities, are the states, and all these issues of private property rights. Anyone care to comment on that?
Mr. Acosta, with all due respect, I will go out on a limb and answer your question indirectly, or at least provide some information, an indirect response to
Based
your
upon past experiences, that's what I'm asking.
Well, that's why I'm going out on a limb. The United States Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii overruled Korematsu versus United States. And prior to that, Korematsu stood for the proposition that national security is a compelling state interest that justifies racial discrimination and
I'm very
intentional
familiar with the
discrimination.
Korematsu order, representing a lot of American of Japanese descent.
And Justice Roberts explicitly recognized Korematsu has been reversed in the court of history, and it was wrong the day it was decided.
Correct.
One implication of that is this, and I would need to confer at length with my colleague Raul Garcia and my colleagues at the ACLU and at the southern borders, and one of the things that is what I'm getting at is this. You have here a combination of Trump acting lawlessly in closing down the government in order to get a wall that's not necessary.
Which is a manufactured crisis.
Exactly. And under that theory, the notion that the government has unstoppable power at the borders to regulate the borders and to protect security is no longer good law because Korematsu has been reversed. And Justice Roberts recognized that when it's not necessary to serve a compelling state interest, and there are less restrictive alternatives, such as the Senate bill that passed, I believe, with 100% support in the Senate.
Right.
For this president to, by himself, close the government to get the wall does not satisfy constitutional scrutiny under Trump versus Hawaii.
Besides being irresponsible.
Because it is discriminatory against the people on the U.S. side of the border who are disproportionately of color, 84%. And so the waiver of the laws itself discriminates on the basis of race in ways that is not necessary, does not serve a compelling state interest, and for which there are less restrictive alternatives. And similarly, the waiver of freedom of religion for Native American people on this side of the border. You are protecting U.S. citizens and U.S. residents on this side of the border against religious discrimination and against racial discrimination. And that requires strict scrutiny. And nobody has applied strict scrutiny to Trump's decision to close the government to get a wall that is not necessary. That is the theory. But who needs interesting
Well, thank you,
litigation
Mr.
theory?
Garcia, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've been very generous with the time you've allotted.
Thank you, sir. Let me invite a new member to Congress and a new member to our caucus and an exceptional addition to this Congress, Ms. Holland from New Mexico. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all so much for being here for this important issue. I know it takes your time and your energy, and I just appreciate all of you being here today. Mr. Jose, I wanted to ask a question of you, and in reading your testimony and our conversation earlier. Because of tribal sovereign rights, building a wall across your nation would most likely require an act of Congress. The Supreme Court has held that in considering whether to act in ways that have an impact on Native Americans, Congress must partake in a detailed consideration of tribal interests. Vice Chairman Jose, is that something that's happening? Has this administration or the previous Congress consulted with you or the tribe about this proposed wall and offered you a seat at the table upholding the federal government's trust responsibility?
Chairman Grijalva and esteemed committee members and Congresswoman Hunt, thank you for that. 160 years ago, the United States of America did not consult with the Tohono. And we continue to ask for a seat at the table. We continue to ask for true government-to-government relationship and discussion, and to respect us as our sovereign rights as a Tohono nation. We have discussions with the local law enforcement, and we have discussions with when we come here to Washington, D.C. We have not had the opportunity to sit face-to-face with the President of the United States to have two discussions on this proposed border wall. We need to have a seat at the table, and I have said publicly, time and time again, President Trump, I welcome you to the Tohono Nation. I will walk with you the 62 miles if we can, because in some areas it's very difficult to even walk, and let alone build a wall there. So we have not had these discussions with the President himself, and we continue to advocate that we need to have a seat at the table, and we'll continue to look forward to address these matters hand in hand, instead of stripping away federal protections, laws that this Congress have made and that have been stripped away by acts of Congress which are waiving the rights of 30-some environmental laws and protections that are out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman. I yield back.
Sovereignty. And Mr. Vice Chairman or Council can answer that. Just on a tangent, it's interesting, I was just thinking to myself, when you mentioned that the National Butterfly Center is suing Trump about the wall and the waivers and all that, and you now join the legions with that lawsuit of a long list of other environmental and human rights organizations that have been labeled as extremist environmentalists trying to stop the government. You were in company of others now, but I find that the heading is kind of interesting because it's National Butterfly Center versus Trump. I thought it's got a nice sound to it, you know? How could you fight that, you know? But anyway, Mr. Vice Chairman, the issue of sovereignty, and following up on the point my colleague made, that would be an act of Congress to suddenly, for 62 miles, lift sovereignty from a federally recognized tribe. Never been done. It's been eroded, as you said, and I venture, I don't know if you agree with the point that Ms. Holland was going, but that would be a major constitutional issue, if not a crisis, that Indian country as a whole would confront, and that this Congress would have to confront as well.
Chairman Grijalva, esteemed committee members, you are correct. You know, the Tohono Nation had on this wall, proposed wall, has supporting resolutions from the Intertribal Council of Arizona and also the National Congress of American Indians. If we are going to go this route, I believe we're not going to stand here alone. We're going to stand here with 500 plus tribes, I believe, that would support us. and more so. From day one, we've been getting calls from around the world on people coming and wanting to stand with the Tohono Nation. I hope we don't have to go down that route. I hope we can address this matter as we've been talking about, working on protecting America, but a wall is not the answer. To strip a tribe of their sovereign rights is the last thing that we want to see, any tribe. When we talk about eminent domain, I believe the tribes of America have eminent domain before we even knew what that word meant. I believe that we have eminent domain there as well, too. But from the legalities of it, if we're going to have to go to there, you are right. It's going to take an act of Congress. And we hope that Congress seriously take a look at what the implications that would have, not only on the Tohono Nation, but the other 500-some tribes that are out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe not necessarily as a closing point, but maybe it is. One question for each panelist, and if you would each respond. And again, my sincere thanks. We're going to disseminate the information, your testimony, the written comments of members that they have submitted, as well as the questions and the responses that you have given the colleagues that are here today, and disseminate it as far as we can, because I think that this is an important part of the discussion. Yes, this government shouldn't be closed, and yes, it should be closed over this phony issue. And but your testimony has been great, and I appreciate it very much. And I know some of you went way out of your way to be here, and that as well is very much, thank you for your consideration. What do you wish the American public that unfamiliar with, and for that matter, the members of in this Congress, unfamiliar with the Southwest, unfamiliar with the borderlands, what would you want them to know about this Southwest border of ours? Either about the environment there, what life is like, and what do you wish that that public and those members of Congress, what do you wish they knew about border walls? If you don't mind, that would be, I guess, the final comments. But if you each could take the time, be very much appreciated. We'll begin over here with Vice Chairman.
For the public to know, and that people in decision-making positions to know, is that the Tohono Nation is a land that we have a responsibility to. It is within our teachings that we don't own the land, that we belong to the land. It is our responsibility, it is within our teachings and our traditional teachings that we care for the land, that we care for the animals, that we're in harmony with Mother Nature. Every stick and stone is sacred. Every plant, every animal. Welcome you out to the Tohono Nation to see the beauty of the land, of the Sonoran Desert, unique in its own way, with the saguaro plants, to the beautiful birds and the butterflies and the animals. And the other day when we were on the border, a deer jumped across the border, and I said, "Where's the Border Patrol? Is that an American deer or is that a Mexican deer?" It doesn't know no boundaries. That's what we need the public to know, that within the Tohono there is no word for wall, because that was never within our teachings. And lastly, I want to say that, with the waiver, it's already a done deal with the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, the act that waives all the rights. I would like to say that although we appreciate that the act requires some consultation with tribes and other border communities, I want to point out that no other group of Americans has been stripped of federal protection in this way. Why should Americans living on border communities not be entitled to the same federal statutory protections that other Americans enjoy? Congressman Grijalva, esteemed committee members, thank you for your time. Joshua Simhoiga, God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Please.
Thank you so much also for this opportunity. I think that when asked that question about the border region, I think, the diversity of the land, of the communities, the beauty of the topography, of the landscapes, the parks, I think has been referenced here, and always encourage people to go both to the urban areas to see the cultural richness as well as to the rural areas. In terms of pieces that I wish were part of this debate, also in discussion, I think, in any policy, we are calling for any policy, whether it's the border wall or any policy towards the border region, should be grounded in data analysis, consultation, and engagement. And I feel like those pieces, when we're talking about the border wall, particularly here in Washington, D.C., get left out of the equation. Pointing out that border communities are some of the safest in the nation, far safer than many interior communities. Also looking at, I think was already pointed out that, there's so much made of illicit drugs coming through the border, and really looking at what's happening in terms of ports of entry, as well as the real need to address this as a public health crisis that it is in communities across our country, and not just blaming the region, and looking at what's happening at ports of entry. The other piece is also we work with a lot of groups that are part of our coalition, our humanitarian aid organization. I think also just remembering who is coming and seeking protection and safety at our border. That is the legacy of the nation at the borders. We're a place of refuge and protection, and that there's so many families, children, who are fleeing spiraling violence and poverty and coming to our southern borders, and really looking at how we can best be the best that we can be in terms of how we approach those arriving.
Thank you. Mr. Garcia.
I would like to say again that the 84% of the population that is of color along the border on the U.S. side, and the Native Americans who stand to lose their sovereignty, are the victims of intentional racial discrimination and discrimination based on religion. And the president can stop that, the Congress can stop that, and the courts can stop that, but ultimately it will require the people, we the people, to stop that. And it is an honor and a pleasure to testify before this committee that looks like this nation, with Congressman Grijalva, Chairman Grijalva, the first Latino chairman of the Natural Resources Committee ever, with a Native American Congresswoman, with the respected representative from the Los Angeles area, and each of you. And it's working together among my colleagues at California LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, that joins in my remarks, and the Praxis Project, and the Center for Biological Diversity. The wall is bringing us together to stop the wall and open the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. National parks are extremely special. They belong to all of us equally, regardless of where they are. So what I want people to think about when they think about the border is Big Bend National Park. You should think of it in the same breath as when you think of Rocky Mountain National Park, or Yosemite, or Yellowstone. They all deserve our protection. And you wouldn't put a wall between the Merced River and Half Dome. You wouldn't put a wall along the Rocky Mountain front. So you shouldn't be doing that. in Big Bend or Oregon Pipe or any of the other parks and public lands along the border. There are better ways to protect our parks and our people. And, you know, land managers on the ground have the knowledge to work with Border Patrol and figure out what those ways are to achieve our goals together. And that collaboration has been successful for the Park Service in many different forms, attacking many different goals, and that should be put in play here as well. So thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garcia?
Thank you, Chairman. I think that one of the main messages that I believe Congress and the administration has to hear is that we cannot fall back into a fake narrative. Facts are still facts, and facts still matter, because those facts are the things that people actually have to live with. And I would urge Congress and I would urge people in the administration to step away from this fake narrative that the border is a dangerous place, that there is somehow no one safe there. That's just not true. And that immigrants are criminals. That is also not true. And it's important to call that out when you see it. And at the same time, it's important to realize the irony that we're living. And that with the waiver of laws, if there is anybody making the border a lawless place, is the Trump administration, not the communities there. They are the ones saying that the rule of law does not matter on the border. And that has to be constantly pointed out to him when he preaches about order and law enforcement. The other notion that I also want to make sure that people remember, particularly about the waiver of laws, it's a word of caution for the administration. While the waiver applies to many laws, it does not apply to the U.S. Constitution. Constitution, separation of powers, the 14th Amendment, all of that is above his waiver. And so we're keeping a close eye on that, and we need to make sure that it's not just us, that it's everybody in Congress, that it's everybody in the community. But thank you so much for your time and attention, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Thank you. Ms. Wright?
Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva and committee members, for inviting me. What would I like people to know who have never visited the Rio Grande Valley? I would like for them to know that our communities, our land, our river is vibrant. It is teeming with life. It is not barren or desolate. It is not devoid of the richness. In fact, incredible, unrivaled richness. We have 11 biologically distinct ecosystems in the four-county region. That is not found anywhere else in North America. But yet there's this idea that the borderlands are a wasteland and unworthy of protection, or that it's okay to just lop them off and throw them away. And nothing could be further from the truth. We are called the Magic Valley for a reason. And we're not even a valley, we're the river delta. And the Rio Grande River has another name. It is called the Rio Bravo because it is big, it is deep, it is wide, it is strong, and it's full of alligators now. So I would want people to come and see for themselves. Part of our vibrant community and economy, and because we are so safe, we get tens of thousands of winter Texans every year. People from all over the United States and Canada who pack up their $250,000 Winnebagos and drive to Mission, Texas to overwinter there. So it is not dangerous, and they go across the border to Progreso for cheap margaritas and dental work and medications to get their prescriptions filled. Does that sound like danger? Lastly, I would like to say that if our portion of wall, which has been funded, which is well underway, which is expected to begin construction in February is allowed to proceed, that President Trump will be effectively ceding a portion of the United States to Mexico. He, by virtue of this wall, is doing what General Santa Anna was never able to do, and pushing the boundaries of Mexico north of the Rio Grande River, putting U.S. citizens and landowners and public lands, private properties, on the other side of the wall, outside of what will be the new national border, this wall. And when did the U.S. government get in the business of giving away the United States of America? This cannot be allowed to stand. I'm grateful for you hearing us and for this opportunity, and I hope that you will act as soon as you can. Thank you.
Appreciate that, and let me ask my esteemed colleague and member of the Resources Committee, gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also thank the witnesses for your testimony today. One area that I did not hear from any of the witnesses was the issue of eminent domain and the taking of properties. And I heard Ms. Wright describe the area along the Rio Grande. With that, and I know it would be disruptive to try to build a structure or to or whatever they're calling it today. But tell me about the taking of land. And I know that private landowners are all along that stretch of our border. So what kind of disruption would that cause? And not just Ms. Wright, but anyone else who wants to pipe in. Go ahead, Ms. Wright.
Thank you, Representative Clay and committee. I am not a lawyer, so the lawyers can speak to that. I can tell you what it is going to happen to us and what's happening to our neighbors. Our neighbors who do not have means and resources are struggling to find legal representation in this battle to hold on to their private property. We have been told there is nothing that can stop the quick take, that if we do not respond to the offer to sell letter coming from the federal government, and we've been given a 14-day turnaround verbally by the Office of Border Wall Management, Department of Homeland Security. When we met with them in December, they asked if when we got our letter in the second or third week of January, and some of our neighbors have already gotten their letters, could we respond within 14 days? And that's prior to even a 100% design build that shows, geologically or geographically exactly how much of our land will be taken, whether we will have a gate, any of that, none of that will be complete. But they want us to accept their offer letter, not knowing how much we're giving up. And that's because they will be initiating the land condemnation and seizure the 1st of February. If the bulldozers are indeed rolling in at the end of February or 1st of March, as we've been told. So we have effectively no rights. If we do not accept the offer letter, we will have to sue the government for inverse eminent domain and wait to be compensated. Now, by rejecting the offer, what we have been told and what happened a decade ago is that landowners who did sue the federal government were compensated on average 1,200 times more than the landowners who did not, which means that landowners with even small parcels of land they've held onto from land grants that are centuries old might have been given $100 or $500 for what was taken from them, whereas large landowners, commercial farmers, developers, and others were given $5 million.
Those who could afford to sue.
Those who could afford to sue.
Okay, does any other panelists have anything to add to the eminent domain issue? Ma'am?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you, Ms. Wright, for your response also. I know that some of the discussions, the rhetoric has been putting forward that eminent domain procedures and process would be some sort of safeguard and a protection for landowners, or it would delay the process in any kind of way. And in reality, what we've seen in the past is, as referenced, that DHS has used these quick take condemnations to take possession of the land, and that even the wall construction has started even before just compensation has been determined and the property owner paid. We know that from roughly 10 years ago, there are still tens of cases still pending in court for those property owners to be compensated for that determination of just compensation. And as referenced in the Rio Grande Valley, we understand that at least 100 landowners have received letters from the federal government that are the first step in the eminent domain seizure process.
Mr. Chairman, I'm concluding my question, but I would ask that this committee, interact with the Homeland Security Committee and Chairman Thompson to ask them to explore this taking of land by the Department of Homeland Security. So hopefully we can entertain that. I yield back.
Mr. Clay, it's an excellent recommendation, and we're going to take you up on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pauta, you were going to also eminent domain or not?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, and the eminent domain issue, we talk about it, but we don't ask what the cost to the government, to the taxpayer is. We need to find out how much eminent domain is entering into the picture. How much is that cost going to the taxpayer? That's one area that is not being looked at. Ms. Wright, who paid for the removal of the debris on that wall?
Representative Napolitano, we had to pay for all of that.
And how much was that?
I would have to go back and calculate all of our manpower hours over 2 years.
Shouldn't that cost be borne by the department that cost it?
Yes, and we did pursue on some level through legal counsel how to achieve that, and we're told that there was no legal recourse.
Mr. Clay, this would be another question for Homeland Security. What their wall costs are after they build it and after they've impeded water from going through and causing a dam. Then the other question I had, I was listening more than anything else, the impact remediation, not just on your area, but in other areas, whether there's an impact on wildlife, on water going into communities in the Indian Nation. What about those costs that are only borne by you and not the government? Because they are the cost of it. And maybe if we start looking at the cost of it and putting it in their lab, they will take a second look at what they're going to build. The eminent domain costs, of course, are important. We should ask the committee to ask the Homeland Security what the costs are of all the eminent domain across the border, because that would add to the figures that they are asking for. You know, by the way, I was born in Brownsville, Texas. I'm a border gal. Muy fronteriza. The wall not being built on the border itself, it's built inside the U.S. lines. And what is that happening all over? Is it just in certain parts? We ought to take a look at the map to see where that border wall is going to be. Then pose the question you said. you're ceding land to Mexico. That should be another point that should be brought out, because that wall essentially is dividing Mexico and the U.S., supposedly, but obviously not. I thank all of you. I thank Mr. Chairman for this briefing, this hearing, but I thank the panelists, and I hope that you band together and talk to the media. Get more people who have actual stories to tell about your areas, but do it together, because then the media will take note that it isn't just one individual agency. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much. And, you know, I was born in the borderlands, still live there. My extended family's from there. And I thought the comment that one of the panelists made, and I'm sorry, I forget who made it, but said, you know, this has been for almost a decade plus blaming the region over and over again. And this whole shutdown, this whole obsession of Trump's and the underlying issues that it brings for this country to have to deal with, which have to do with race, and they have to do with poverty, and they have to do with lack of representation many times. It's all part of this discussion. And I appreciate it, because what I hope we can do is to have a good look at those borderlands and not go on assumptions and stereotypes and misinformation that has been poured down people's throats for the last decade plus. You know, it's good people, hardworking people, very diverse, a very curious part of the United States about everything, and it's part of the new West as well, very much so. And so I hope that as this discussion goes forward, you being here today is very important. And the two follow-ups, I thought, points from this, from your testimony that was good, is all of it was good. But I think a follow-up, you know, we should audit the 700 miles that were done and look at worst practices, and see where the stories that we know. We should look at the issue of eminent domain. It was suggested by Mr. Clay and Mr. Napolitano, in terms not only of cost, but of the implication for that in this whole discussion. And I think the impact on the environment is obvious. The cost to community, both economically and socially, is obvious. If you go to any border community and you see the boarded up downtown, that used to be a very vibrant downtown, and expand the definition of border security beyond the very narrow, myopic, whacked out vision that we're listening to from the president and some of his enablers here in Congress, that it's more than this discussion we're having. It is much broader, and then it can accommodate sovereignty. It can accommodate people's rights, and it can accommodate security. And I want to thank you for that. Your perspectives are very important. Thanks a lot. I guess we're done. Appreciate it. Thank you, my brother.